Welcome to Mattys Mental Health Podcast, aiming to spread awareness on mental health by sharing the real life stories.
Austin, Lynds.
He got it right this time.
I was going to say Lynds, but I knew better.
Yeah, good man. Mark it down. Most Islanders don't get it yet, but they'll figure it out.
What's going on, Mr. Lynds?
Not much. Currently staying inside from a blizzard. I was out in it all day today, though, for school, walking.
You're a bad man out in the blizzard. So you've been on before. So this is Austin Lynds number 2.
Yeah, I think this was the first one was number 5.
Yeah, so it's been a while.
Very early, yeah.
So I'm happy to have you on because you've been doing some interesting things. Yeah, let's jump into it. So what's been going on since we last chatted?
So, the normal. Dropped out of school, went back to school. Dropped out of school, went back to school. Changed careers. Joined a community. Founded on faith and changed my life. Traveled the world. That kind of stuff. So, an average Sunday.
Stuff. Yeah. So before we get into it too much, I just want to frame it with the fact that you what I've admired about you, we went to school together for a quick background, we went to school together, and I've kind of seen your progression since then. That was 4 or 5 years ago now, I guess.
I was just a baby.
6 years ago now, actually.
Yeah.
But I've seen your spiritual progression, and I'm sure we're going to get into that today. But your spiritual progression and faith and sense of community, and I think that's things that, if we're talking about mental health, that's things that aren't as common today. So I just think it's cool, and it'd be a cool thing to talk to you about.
Yeah. So last I was on was 2019, I believe, and it was pretty much right after that the world went crazy, turned upside down, and everything changed. For me as well, particularly in my own personal life, it reflected in the same way. Oh, what is that? Just a moment. So basically, there we go. I was, shortly after we spoke on the last podcast, I had shifted from university at the time. I had dropped out of it because I had a bit of a burnout from there, to finishing a powerlifting competition, and then I had either just done it or was about to do it. And then from there was serving full time with the Bahai community, who is a dear group of friends of mine founded on a faith that is based in unity amongst all people. And I had worked with them very closely. That was my first time doing kind of an intensive string of summer camps with them as sort of my full-time job, basically. And that was I had been with them for about a year and change, but that was sort of the first real exposure of a life-changing experience, was that summer for me in that case. And then from there, started the job at Good Life. And shortly after leaving there, the pandemic happened.
We should probably preface, I know you explained this to me just before we chatted, but and I know you talked about it last time, the Bahai community. Could you explain a little bit more? I know you mentioned it's a faith. Could you go ahead and explain a little bit more about it?
Of course, yeah. So in the simplest, in layman's terms, the Bahai faith is a religion that is founded amongst unity amongst all peoples, right? It's that's the foundational principle of all else. Its belief system is that all other faiths, like Christianity, the Muslim faith, Buddhism, and those kinds of singular faiths revolving around one or a handful of specific gods, but one central being, are kind of all preaching the same message, but in a different context and different scenario, environment based on the the culture and the time. So looking at it from an academic standpoint, you could look at the Bahai faith as sort of the newest draft of that article, so to speak. And their foundational belief is that each of these prophets were manifestations of God. So sort of the window by which God shines through, and they were each providing a different message for a different time. The Bahai message which is very telling considering the world that we're in at the moment, is unity amongst all people, like working together to leave the world better than we found it, which we've seen to a degree, the world be very united on a lot of fronts, but also be very divided on a lot of fronts from the pandemic and now the current political situation. So the point that when I first joined them, I was kind of in a really rough place in my life mentally. I was struggling in school, was very kind of alone, and was lacking a very strong community aspect of my life, which is like a very important part of my life. I had it very strongly when I was home with my family and was lacking it when I came to PEI. So when I found this community of extremely diverse, spiritual, loving people from different parts all around the world, it was kind of an eye-opening experience culturally, but also in every fiber of my being, it was challenging in the beginning. A lot of the traditional kind of man's man North American values of kind of conservatism and toxic masculinity was kind of beaten with a stick and kind of challenged in every front. So avenues of vulnerability and stuff like that were also opened up.
Can I slow you down a little bit? Just, I don't mean to back you up, but
That's okay.
I think with I really like how you put that with the Bahai is like the newest. That's like the newest version of that draft. If you think about like religions,
kind of like, yeah.
Does it take from other religions? Like, does it take?
I would say yeah, but I mean, in the same way that they all take from each other. When you strip sort of the rules and the protocol away from each faith in formalities and rituals and that kind of stuff, the foundational principle is sort of the oneness of humanity, right? Jesus, Muhammad, Krishna, Buddha, they all preach the foundational message of work together, bring peace, and love each other, right?
Right.
And the Bahai faith sort of just like it has its own rules and kind of scriptures and stuff like that, kind of, but it's more doubling down on the love and unity aspect. So, for example, my friends in the Bahai community, many of them have actually moved off of PEI since. They've gone to different countries and stuff like that. Lal, who's kind of like one of my dearest friends, and he was kind of like one of the head guys here. He had just moved to what their Vatican is. It's called Haifa in Israel. And Haifa is sort of like the Bahai World Center where you kind of live and work intensely with that community and kind of sort of really dial in on developing your spiritual capacities, quote unquote, to serve your communities better. Sort of like living in the Vatican, working there, being a part of it, kind of being fully immersed in the culture. And then other friends of mine have moved to New Zealand and stuff. But the community in itself, because it's so practically embedded in unity, it is constantly expanding and constantly adding to its diversity. So most of my friends on PEI are not even from Canada necessarily. They weren't born in Canada. They're either Canadian immigrants or international students or people who are getting their PR or stuff like that, which is probably one of my favorite things about the community. A dear friend of mine, she's my roommate here. She's from Nepal. My two dearest friends are basically family at this point. I celebrated Christmas with them in the Middle East. They grew up in Muscat, Oman, and they're born South African. So I think personally, a huge part of my growth, which is significant for anybody when they travel, when they experience the world in different cultures, is being exposed to that, right? So me being exposed to the different musics, the different demeanors, the different kind of social norms, right? Like guys here, they'll hug a couple of close guy friends, their brothers, stuff like that, but it's normally short, sweet, kind of whatever, nothing really intense. But like my guy friends here that are particularly, especially friends through that community, like giant bear hugs all the time, like very physical with each other, very close all the time. Have no problem telling each other we love them. Have no problem loving each other. Like it's such a really like, there's something that's so heartwarming and something that's so endearing about this community because guy or girl, there's just so much love either way, which I think is foundational and kind of a standard for any friendship. And that's how I kind of carry myself either way. That's how I was raised, right? Show loyalty and love to your people constantly. But that's a very rare thing for a lot of people, especially around here in Canada, who have been born and raised kind of, white Canadian dudes. It's a new thing for a lot of us, but it's a very important thing.
Can I just say, by the way, like, you know, side point here, like how much growth that I've seen in you in the last 6 years of you talking right now.
Yeah,
like just for like a reference, 6 years ago,
oh fuck,
you were you were a caveman lifting as much weight as possible in the gym, listening to loud music.
Yeah, big old Brutus beefcake.
Yeah,
like shaved my head while prepping for a powerlifting competition just so I could save money on food by not spending it on shampoo. Like that level of muscle for brains type dude. Yeah, it was I appreciate that. Yeah, that's I think about that a lot. I think about the change that's happened there. And it's that part of my life I hold so dearly to me. Like I hold so close to home because it was really important for me at the time. Sometimes we look back at ourselves and we're kind of like, oh, I was such a fucking jackass or something along those lines. Like we look at ourselves and we're like, I was such a jerk or I was so dumb or something along those lines. But for me, I was like, I was doing the best I had with what I had, right? And I was the first person in my family to go to a post-secondary anything. And was the last person in my family that anybody expected to do it, right? And I went full blown. I grabbed kind of fitness and personal training, which was the only thing I felt like I was good at that point in my life, just by the throat, and ran with it. And I went at it with such passion and tenacity and such a desire to prove everybody around me that doubted me wrong, from like my own dad to former teachers to that kind of stuff. Like I had a point to prove. And not just to them, but also I think to myself. There's definitely was a lot of imposter syndrome, and there was definitely a lot of like obviously struggling with depression, anxiety, ADHD. That was stuff that like there was so much going on there, and I didn't know I had any of that at the time. I assumed I was depressed, but I didn't know I was anxious, and I didn't know I had ADHD, and I didn't even know I was colorblind at that point. And I found all that out years later. But at the time, it was so important for me to be that guy. It was so important for me to grow into that man and to be the caveman and to be the conqueror and to be the person who saw a mountain that was way too tall to imagine climbing it and look at it and said, up it, I'm gonna try it anyway. And if I fall, then I'm gonna just keep trying it until I get there, right? And it worked. It worked out well. I came through there and I won my first powerlifting competition on the same weekend I graduated with pretty good marks, all things considered.
It's kind of like the warrior archetype of masculinity, like the creative, like from boy to man thing, where it's like going out, proving yourself.
Yeah.
Seeing the mountain that's too large and climbing it. Yeah,
sort of the hero's journey narrative in that way. And that was something that I learned a bit about after the fact. And I was like, oh, I was this person at this point. I wasn't just being an arrogant, I'm the main character type vibe. Like this was the narrative that I had built for myself, but it was also the narrative that I was in circumstantially. And that was eye-opening and humbling, because it was right after this high point, and this is very crucial for the mental health part of it. It was right after this high point that when I started at UPEI, it was a rapid plummet. I was at the top of the mountain. I had conquered everything that I had set out to conquer. And then at this point, I was standing with this diploma, no idea what came after this, with my first gold medal in powerlifting. And I was like, what happens now? And I was like, well, I'm going to keep competing in powerlifting. And I'm going to, because I wanted to try to get to nationals before I was in my 30s. And win nationals before I was 25 kind of thing. That was my mentality. But also I wanted to go into strength and conditioning coaching. Like the barbell at that point was my life. And that was the only thing I knew how to be. And that was the only narrative that anybody ever told me that I was, right? So that was like, now there was an expectation. Now it wasn't proving people wrong. It was meeting an expectation that was now set. Austin's the strong guy. Austin's the fitness guy. Austin is the successful hard worker guy. Mr. Hustle. which inspired a lot of people from my hometown, from my community around me, my little brothers, that kind of stuff. Like it inspired a lot of people. So now I had this pressure. So when I started a UPEI, I was way in over my head. It was like, no idea what's going on, had never taken chemistry, physics, calculus, any of these advanced sciences ever, not even in high school. Like I took like the basis for like average level stuff, but I never took a calculus or a chemistry class in high school. So I was completely out of my element. And then I found out I was colorblind and had severe ADHD, which both were kind of crippling things. As funny as they were, the colorblindness was kind of crippling for the chemistry because we had titration labs and color-based labs and stuff like that. So then, and I took those labs before I found out and failed them severely because of it. And same thing with like the ADHD and the 5 course a semester with 2 labs. And I was studying all hours of the day, training twice a day, like for morning cardio to kind of get my ADHD under control, but also lifting in the evening, running on a couple 100 calories a day, just because I didn't have time to make proper food or eat properly. And I didn't have the money for much food. And I would study at school till like 4 in the morning and then get up and do it again. And I lived in Sherwood, which was behind the campus, and I don't have a car. So I was walking to and from school every day, walking back up that hill past the, like the hockey school behind UPEI or the private school building kind of thing.
Yeah.
The Mount, I think it is. So I was walking up there to like Oak Drive and that kind of stuff. So eventually my body just gave out, and my brain did too. I started having some family issues back home that were related to my past traumas with my parents, particularly my father. And a lot of issues were going on. Papa's health had fallen into the pits, who was my grandfather, the man who basically raised me for most of my life, in the father figure role. And then my body gave out because I got a sciatic nerve injury because I was still trying to do powerlifting while doing all this. And I was misdiagnosed for about 1.5 years. So I didn't even know it was a sciatic nerve injury. They told me it was like an MCL tear, a meniscus tear. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. And that went on for about 2 years of just constant pain in my left leg, like a lightning bolt was shooting up it. And I was failing out of school in the full shebang. So eventually about 1.5 years in, I dropped out. And was kind of, at that point, I had just kind of gotten things a little bit more under control and was kind of getting my head together. I knew I couldn't be in school anymore. So for me, leaving it was a really positive thing. But it was also like a lot of anxiousness there because I was like, now what do I do? I had failed tremendously on something that I had set out to do after having all these expectations. And I was kind of went from the top of the heap as sort of that warrior archetype to a broken, very emotionally messed up dude. So from there, that was around that time that I got involved and met and kind of enveloped myself into service with my friends in the Bahai community and that kind of stuff and running kids camps. And then from there was basically rebuilding into a whole other person that you see now.
I think that's so common to fall into the expectations of yourself, like to fall into like. I think of some of it's like an identity thing. Like, this is who I am. I'm gonna be the coach. I'm gonna be the guy that conquers the next mountain. Like you kind of have the identity like figured out for the rest of your life.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of a trap that we all can, and I think it's very common to fall into. It's just like, this is who I am, and this is my expectations, and this is my identity.
This is what I'm meant to be. And I think it's very common with sort of, I don't want to say, it's kind of is, it's like with sort of with the entrepreneurial hustle culture that's very strong in today's world, through social medias and stuff like that. I find people get lost in the hustle very quickly. And I find people get lost in, I myself learned and have been learning that I became like a workaholic as my addiction of choice. Addiction runs in my family on both ends, typically through alcohol and cigarette use, due to traumas and not being able to cope. And mine was, I'm not going to be an alcoholic because I've seen the damage it does. And I'm not going to smoke because I'm an athlete. but this is my vice now because this is how I bury the issue. And a lot of people fall into that trap. And then when it's centered in your identity, it's kind of like, then there's a deeper rut to that hole. And that was, yeah, definitely. I feel like that's super common, especially in young people nowadays. People get so lost in this concept of who we're supposed to be, when in reality, individuals are way too fluid and way too wide spectrum as just a society and just as individuals for us to be limited to I'm this or I'm that, right? I'm not just a teacher, I'm not just a volunteer, and I'm not just an athlete. I'm all those things, right?
Yeah. That's, I think I'm echoing a bit there, but the identity of one thing, like, I think that can be a huge problem when you're just one thing.
Because it's so tantalizing, you know? It makes things seem simple, right? When you're just, this is me, this is all I am, right? But then when you lose that, you're left with nothing. I identified myself as spit and grit, barbell in my hand until I'm dead, right? And then I couldn't put the barbell in my hands anymore for a while.
It's like,
and I was like,
who are you now?
Exactly. Your physique starts to change, your body starts to change. You can't do the same things you were doing because you're getting older and you're getting beat up and you're not taking care of yourself the proper ways. Suddenly, the wake-up call's coming. Either way, God's going to sort you out, but it's up to you whether or not you're going to look at it, you know, on the easy end or the hard end. And unfortunately, because such is the nature of Lynds boys, I had to learn the hard way.
I think that is an extremely common story too with young people. And like,
yeah,
I went through it myself too. It was like football for me. Like when I was, like when I was 20, like around, I think it was second year, got injured playing football. And that's like, that was my main focus for like 5 years. Like kind of, that's like, you know, kind of growing in my late teens. Like this is my main focus. That happens a lot with sports. And I've talked to a lot of people that have said that, where, you know, you're an athlete and then that's kind of like your identity. And then when you lose that, it's really hard to let that go. Or it's really hard to, the thing is that you just have to find yourself.
Yeah. It's I find that when I hit that rut of, and I remember it very vividly. I remember I had my first anxiety attack that I can recall. And it was in the middle of my winter semester. I had had a fight with my dad, and then I was overloaded with work. And my first immediate reaction when I felt my heart rate just shoot up like a gun was to go to the gym. So I went straight there, and I walked in, and my friend Amy, I've mentioned before, she took one look at me. She's like, "You can't be here." And she's like, "You need to go somewhere else, find a dark corner. Let me get my stuff together. I'll come sit with you. This is what's happening." Right. And for a while, I was just like, please let me do this. I need to get this out. Or I didn't know what else to do. My immediate coping mechanism was that, but it wouldn't have helped. So, but I remember it afterwards. I remember going kind of like just sitting after she had sat with me through it. She had to go run some errands and stuff like that. She's like, "Are you gonna be okay?" I was like, "Yeah, I just need to sit and think for a minute." And I remember sitting there thinking, and I was like, at this point, I know something's wrong. And at this point, I can continue down this path to God knows where it's going to be, and it's not going to be pretty. Or I can make an effort to make something different happen. And I didn't have any idea what to do at that point, but I knew something had to change. And I knew the person that I wasn't who I could be. I had to give that up. And that's a fucking difficult pill to swallow. When you're sitting there and you're kind of struggling with every aspect of who you are is no longer who you are anymore, at least in your visible sense, like at least from as far as you can see. Suddenly now things have changed and you can't be this guy anymore. And that's painful, right? When your identity is associated with that, because you feel like you're letting everybody down and you're not good enough and all these different things. So that change, though, I'm so grateful for it, because it ultimately brought me to when I started volunteering in the kids camps, and suddenly I felt this light come back into me over time. of at the start of the camps, we kind of get together, we have coffee together, tea, that kind of stuff, a little bit of a breakfast at the Bahai Center. And then we like sing some music and like on a ukulele, just like the animators and the people running the camps and stuff. We would sing some music and do some prayers and spend some time together, just kind of enjoying each other's company and being present with one another and sharing what's on our hearts and stuff like that, and kind of getting it out there and providing this space of sort of therapeutic love for one another to kind of vitalize ourselves for the day. Because you need a lot of energy for those kids. you really do. And it was one of those things, like every morning and every time we would sing these songs together, and every week when we would have these gatherings and stuff like that, it was just like, this is where I belong, right? And that to me was like, and it was such a hard thing at first to wrap my head around, because it was completely left field from where I wanted to be, where I thought I was going to be. I thought of myself as a fighter, as a hardcore athlete, as a, kind of protein shake in one hand and dumbbell in the other. I'll stop when I'm dead or I can't move anymore. Shifting completely to putting down the metaphorical sword and picking up the book and pair of reading glasses and teaching a bunch of kids about their spirit and about empowering them and about using their skills to kind of go out into the community and leave it better than they found it. And to me, it's like the foundational goal was always to help people, but to see it so viscerally in such a different way than fitness, which is still near and dear to my heart in a lot of ways, but to see it change so much and to see like these kids going out and joyfully doing these things for the community was like, holy shit, this is what I'm supposed to be doing right now. And that was kind of where that shift started to happen. I remember I started journaling and I started writing again at that point, which I was really great in English class and writing and stuff like that in high school. It was like the class that I wouldn't have to study for anything, and I'd come out with a 99 every time. But I was told you couldn't get a job with English, so I was like, okay, whatever. But I started journaling, I started writing out my thoughts, and I finished that journal last year, cover to cover, and it's got memories over the course of years and stuff like that. Of what was going through my head during these periods of my life. And the change is so gradual, but also drastic, right? And I remember the first thing I wrote in it was, I'm going to try my hand at this. I was kind of with an iffy relationship with God at this point. I was like, I don't know what he wants me to do. I'm not sure if I agree with him. I'm not sure I'm not sure I think he knows what he's doing with me. And people are telling me now that I'm a good fit for this role as sort of a mentor and a guide. And I don't know if they're right or not, but I'm going to try and dazzle them with brilliance or baffle them with bullshit and see what happens. I had no confidence in myself in that. And then years later, I'm here, right? So it was I wish I could look back at that point. And I wish I could go back to that point and just kind of look that person in the eye and say, like, you're on the right path. So there wasn't so much perpetual doubt going through my mind in the early stages.
Well, dude, like, first of all, that's such a profound change and shift. And even like the way you describe that, like put down the weight in the protein shake and pick up a book and your reading glasses and teach children about their spirit and about love. It's like, that's such a shift. That's such a change in life, man. Like, you can see how there would be doubt. Like, am I supposed to be doing this? And it's like such. You look at like identity. That's like a complete 180 identity change.
Yeah. Did not anticipate being an English teacher when I first came here 6 years ago, which is now what I'm going to do. It's one of those things.
I think, by the way, though, even like like when we went to school together and stuff, like, even though you were like the kind of the metaphoric caveman in the dungeon gym in the basement deadlifting all day, I think that even back then you could see like your depth, that you had depth. It wasn't, that was what you were doing, but you could also see that there was depth there.
Yeah, it wasn't so much like I think I was trying to put on the facade of the simple meathead because it was easy. And I didn't mean I had to do the deep work that I needed to do to explore this depth that I had found and I knew was there, because I was taught that that depth was bad. And I was taught that to have that range of kind of emotional vibrancy, but also spiritual depth, was not productive and not helpful, and was useless in today's world in a very practical mentality kind of way. My father is a very practical man, and he raised us to kind of be that way. My mom is kind of a no nonsense no bullshit woman. She's got some very strong spiritual aspects to her, but the kind of the culture I grew up in is that, get the work done, worry about the other shit when the work done is done, but the work was never done. So, yeah. But when that shift started to take place and I started going into that, it was a sense of familiarness, but also very deep fear of what this means, right?
I imagine that at like a core level as well. Like it's like when your parents, when you're in general, when you're taught something is not the way to go, it's not the right path, or if it's a waste of time.
Yeah.
It's like if you grew up in a culture where that, or I think it's just like a fundamental, I think a lot of people go through this too. It's like a fundamental fear that you're going against what was taught of you. And I think it's like,
Yeah.
it's like that saying of becoming an adult, where you start to look at your parents like adults, or just as peers rather.
Yeah.
And it's like they didn't know everything. It's kind of like going against the grain of their wishes to go on your own path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one of the best conversations I had was when that expectation that I thought was on me was subverted. When I spoke with my mom and I was like, I want to do this, and then I want to do this, and then maybe I'm going to try this instead because these two things didn't work out. And every time I changed career paths, I think 3 or 4 times between UPEI the first time and now, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And every single time my mom's like, sure, let's try it. Right. So I'm grateful for that, because my mom's always been my number one supporter. And I expected anybody else to turn around and say, just fucking pick something and stick with it. Like, what's wrong with you? My mom was always like, no, you need to figure this out. You're not going to do a job that's menial and that's just going to pay the bills, because that's just not how you're wired. But it's also like, you need, job or not, to, like, even if it's not your career, whatever you're doing, you need to do something that's cool, because you have that in you.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot deeper. And when I made that kind of choice to shift from just practical to just career, was the only thing I was thinking about, to working on my spirit. My mom's like, I don't really understand all of it, but I know that it's right for you because I see the shift and I want you to dive into this, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think my mom's a spiritual juggernaut in that way, without knowing it, right? Like, without having to be exposed to those teachings, she was teaching me the same thing over and over and over again, either way, which I think was so important for my character. And as well with my dad as well, as much as my dad's a practical minded man, as I got older, I saw where he was coming from, and I saw kind of where the spiritual lessons lay in those as well, right? Yeah. So I think that it's sort of the rebellion against the parent that leads to a sort of coming of agreements with that, right? Which is very common for people. What started as me proving my dad wrong turned into me having a conversation with my dad on the porch about life under the stars, like we used to when I was a kid, right? Which was, forget about it. That was not a thought process I had throughout the last, probably the first 3 or 4 years of the 6 years that I've been here, right?
Right. Yeah, that's beautiful, man. It's like, coming around full circle.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you think you should be doing this, you think you should be doing that. You're going against the grain, I'm gonna prove them wrong.
Yeah.
And then you get to a place one day where you're just like living your own life, doing your own thing, and you have that conversation over the stars again.
Yeah. And suddenly it all makes sense, right? In that way.
Yeah.
Because I remember it was one of those things, it wasn't really until the last 2 years that I came to that point of my own clarity with where I wanted to be. Because the big thing for a while for me was like, what do I want to do with my life career-wise? That is something practically I need to think about. Now that I've kind of begun to work on my spirit through volunteer and serving with my community, I also need to figure out how I'm going to pay the bills. So I thought about that. And I thought about what I was doing and what brought me joy. But then I was also like, yeah, but I don't want it to consume my life the way personal training did. So when I finally turned around and went to teaching, it was actually something I had thought about for years, but wasn't entirely sure. But ultimately, I fell in love with being in that role. And I fell in love with working with kids, and I fell in love with working with youth. And I fell in love with being able to share knowledge. And one of the biggest things for me has been being that teacher for students that I never had, or that I want, like you'd have once in a while as a substitute, that was like, you have this learning disability that I have, and you struggle in this way the same way I did. Let's get through this stuff, as opposed to being the teacher that was kind of just a jerk, right? But it was important for me to kind of transition to this role in my life, not just for the practical aspects of it, but because of what it meant for my spirit, in the way of, I can't be something if it doesn't involve service at this point, and not just service for monetary value, which my issue before was eventually after a while in personal training, because it's such a hustle. I was working with people for the sake of making a buck. And to me, that's, for the amount of respect I have for the profession and the amount of love I have for it, to me, that felt wrong, right? That felt like it was like, I'm not doing this for the right reasons anymore, right? It's not about helping people anymore. It's about putting food on the table, which is a noble cause, but still that's more selfish than I want it to be. So when I went into, when that transition began, there was a lot of boxes that I needed to kind of get through, right, emotionally, before I really knew. And it was the conversation you'd have all the time. I'd have it with my dad, I'd have it with people. So like, what are you doing with your life? Because the first thing anybody asks you when they haven't seen you in a while is, what's your job, right? Or what are you doing, right? Like that kind of thing as an adult. So it was really difficult, because people always think of the practical stuff, which is important to a degree. But when you're kind of working through on the other end of the spectrum, which is sort of the impractical but necessary parts of the deeper reaches of who you are, not everybody understands going into that. So there was a lot of resistance that I think I had to work through to get there.
Yeah, it's very common, isn't it? First thing, I think echoing there a little bit. First thing someone asks is like, what are you doing for a job? What do you, and it's almost like it's not always a judgment. Sometimes it could be lean more that way, but it's also just like something to ask. It's like, kind of, what are you doing with your life? Because we all gotta fucking do it with our lives. We all gotta do something every day.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's almost like, just what are you up to now? But I definitely get that, where it's like, that's, and I think, we're in our mid-20s. Like, the older I get, the less I ask that question to people. It's more just like,
me too.
It's like, what's that? What else is going on? It's like,
like how,
we all gotta
like, how are you doing as a person, right? As opposed to, what were you doing this week, right? Kind of thing.
Yeah, I think we all gotta. I mean, even if you enjoy your job, you really enjoy your job, you're passionate about your job, like, it's also just a job. It's also just what you do. It's coming back to the identity thing. It's like, well, there's a lot more to, that's kind of the pitfall of that identity thing too, where it's like, there's a lot more to life. Like, what about like, your relationships?
What are your hobbies?
Yeah,
What do
your
you
health,
exactly?
your
Yeah.
hobbies, um, yeah, your faith, or what you're learning about anything, like
Mhm. How are you
interesting
working through
conversation.
the inner reaches of your heart?
Let's go straight in with
It's one of
that.
my
Straight into
favorite.
that
Occasionally, when I'm like catching up with somebody, so like, so what kind of demons are you dealing with right now? Right? Like,
Yeah.
if they're comfortable enough with it. But yeah, like it's a when I remember pretty vividly. I had a conversation with a dear friend of mine, Lal, about the kind of man that I wanted to be versus where I was, and it was the first point where I felt like the shift was the positive one, and he says like you're well on your way, and you have been this man for quite some time, right? So that was kind of like sort of I find people get very much lost in the pursuit of an identity without realizing that their character is well on the rise as is, right?
Mm.
The shift when I came out of the pandemic, shortly after my grandfather had passed away, was like I was not practically in a great place, and basically was unemployed in between places to live. Was back in Nova Scotia, and my grandfather had just died, and now the world was shut down. So that was, I'm great, as much as it was awful and horrific, I'm grateful for the time because it was a period of 8 months where I had to sit inside and hibernate and think and do the deep work. And I remember that was also when my friendship and what would become a near family relationship in regards to how close we are with a dear friend of mine, Roxy, who's Russell's younger sister, also a teacher. The three of us are teachers. Kind of a friend of the community, that kind of stuff. We'd known each other for quite some time, but we had started speaking more regularly and messaging more regularly. She was in Oman, I was here. And there was a lot of conversations about the heart and the spirit, about the kind of people, like the kind of demons that people are struggling with, and my own struggles and stuff like that. These deeper, much more than like, so what have you been doing this week? Or well, what were you up to last Monday? Or along those lines, like the nonsense conversations that we sometimes have needlessly. These deeper reaches were kind of sort of a constant topic of conversation and still are. And that's when I noticed a lot of positive changes, right? But the thing is that a lot of people are scared of those conversations because typically by the end of it, you're sitting there like, oh shit, I didn't realize I had this, and this to deal with, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, peeling back the onion.
Mm-hmm. There's layers to that bad boy. Yeah.
So, I mean, you talked about joining and how beneficial it was to start working with the kids and start having the community. I guess just quickly, just came to my mind, like, how did you find them?
So Amy and I had spent pretty much every day in university, like studying together, working together, training together. And she, much like myself, was a workaholic. We were constantly looking for stuff to do in volunteer programs and stuff like that. She was looking about getting into med school, so she was justifiably looking for lots of stuff to do. So at the time anyway. So then she stumbled upon this community, just at a job or a volunteer fair kind of thing, like at UPR, where they just had booths up for people and like, here's different extracurricular things you can do. And the Bahais are advertising their stuff there, just because like as part of expanding the community to kind of bring more people in to work with the kids and stuff like that. Sometimes they would do stuff like that. Not so much now, but like we'll sometimes go out into the university, have gatherings and invite people and see if they like it. And if they do, then, they kind of join up on their own volition rather than being asked. But that was basically what happened. I was like, yeah, this looks cool, but I don't know anything about it. It seems very cool. There's a spiritual aspect to it. Why not? And then I met Lal shortly afterwards. Amy introduced me to him. And I'll never forget the level of, because at this point I had a great deal of emotional walls up. And I remember physical closeness was not something I was very much used to at that point outside of family. And I remember this guy came up to me while I was studying at the library, and he just kind of like hopped on the end of the couch, put his arm around my shoulders, and kind of put his hands on my traps, kind of thing. He's like, "What are you up to?" "My name's Lal." And I was like, super disarming at this point. This, brown skin, long black hair, Jesus looking dude, just sort of hops up on my side like he was my little brother. And he was just kind of asking me how to do it. But he like had this energy, this charisma about him as an individual that just was a sort of youthful abandon, I guess I could put it. Lal himself is a 30-some-odd-year-old man with the spirit of a 5-year-old, right? Like he is true to heart, a ball of sunshine. One of the most gentle, compassionate, loving, one of the greatest men I've ever met. Like probably one of the best men I'll ever know. And my friendship with him developed shortly after this, and we became best friends very, very quickly. And I worked very closely with him in the community and stuff like that. He was kind of like one of the head people. There's no real leader in the Bahai community, but there are people who are very experienced and running a lot of the programs and stuff. And at the time, Lal was one of these guys who, he actually arrived on PEI the same time I did in 2015. But he specifically arrived to help uplift the activities here while also doing his Bachelor of Education, his Master's of Education when he came here. So he was full blown into teaching and all these different things and working with the children directly. It was one of those things of, I watched this person who had this level of light to his personality that I can only describe as radiant. And it was like, I want to have that light about my character, because I feel like there's just nothing but dark shit going on right now. And I want to change that, because it just doesn't feel good, right? It doesn't feel good to be, feeling like you're locked in a depression and can't get out. And I wanted to change that. So he showed me, and it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows either. Like, he's like, no, there's a lot of messy work that needs to be done. Lal came from the ghetto of Guyana, right? Like, grew up in the hood, like was exposed to gang violence and stuff like that super early on. It's like he'd seen a lot of things and still had this love about him as a man. So that to me was inspirational, but also like, this is the kind of character that I want to surround myself with, so that I can kind of grow and meet that and hopefully be that for somebody else later. And then that ultimately, that's what became, and then a budding friendship kind of blossomed into a brotherhood that still stands strong to this day since then. And then through that, it became like I was invited to this gathering, and then a weekly gathering that we would go to and have like dinner and do some kind of work with the texts that we have that like have basically workshops of community building, like teach you skills on how to work with the junior youth groups and how to work with the kids and how to do outreach and that kind of stuff, practical stuff. But also with a strong spiritual undertone to it, a lot of moral lessons and conversations around deeper reaches of the soul and how to develop your character in such a way that unity is the message you give out constantly. And these gatherings became more and more and more. And then eventually I was running 2 junior youth groups before I'd even done the training to do it. And then we were getting involved in camps and running the summer programs, and then off I went. It was kind of thrown into the fire and baptism by kind of social fire, so to speak, because I was super introverted at the time, and then you're constantly exposed to large crowds like over and over again. So it was a massive shift, but it started just as we were looking for volunteer programs with our community. We were looking to do more than just schoolwork all the time, and we stumbled upon this, and I'm so glad we did, right?
It's funny too, like you mentioned before, like the whole thing about like the work you're doing not necessarily being practical or not being seen that way, and then just everything you just outlined there, it's like that's all practical stuff you could easily and you will take into the next thing you do.
Yeah.
Even like the interpersonal skills, emotional intelligence. Like if you're going to be a teacher, you're practicing with kids every day, but even like all the lessons and the morals and connection to yourself, I think that's it. I think that's not to be misunderstood as not practical, even though but that's like, I think that's kind of the societal
It really is. Yeah. Because a lot of the practical world of society, like when you're looking at strictly that, is they just want to produce good workers, right? But we're so much more than that as people. All the skills I learned with the Baha'i community have served me so much more than any hustle culture nonsense ever would, right? Because you can be a good worker, but if you've got no good reason other than just being a good worker, then it's ultimately hollow. But the skills that I've learned through them have developed lasting relationships, lasting friendships, have helped me grow into a man that inspires a great deal of people, hopefully, and kind of is doing a lot of good work to kind of leave his community better than he found it. And these changes happen because of the work that we were doing, right? So, and entire neighborhoods across the world have been turned on their head, from ghettos to upstanding neighborhoods, because of these programs we do with youth, right? Like, because it's teaching people how to be kind to each other and how to have a community mindset, and shifting from like, oh, we don't talk to these people even though they're our neighbors in our apartment building, to we're making supper, invite them in, right? Like, let's just have food, why not, right? And then those minute gestures, become potentially something that's life-changing for that person, right? The amount of times that I've seen somebody who's just like a student at a university going through it, we have no idea they're going through it, and they're like, hey, you seem chill, do you want to come to this potluck we're having down at my buddy's place, where we like, play music and hang out and play games and go over some of the prayers and texts. And then we see this person, this light eventually come on by the end of the night in this person, and they're, you see them kind of start to go on that path of growth as well. It's like, I'd lose count over time, right? The amount of times that everybody in that community at some point has been exposed to that and seen it and had that change in their life.
I think about this a lot. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, like the void of, because I don't know, I guess over the last whatever it's been, 40, 50 years, well, I don't know the number, but there's been a decline in religion. And I think about the void of spirituality, the void of faith. And people might hear that and be like, well, like, turned off by church and all that stuff. And I certainly, like, that's why
Which would be
younger, I don't
entirely fair. They've not exactly done a great job historically anyway, right? Like, but
I think there's like, as humans, like, we kind of need something like a bigger ideal of like the morals to follow, and also like the faith in something. It's like the thing that's larger. I think that's like a requirement.
It's a conduit for change.
Yeah,
it really is. Like, one of the first things I remember when I started, because I myself am not necessarily a Bahai. I'm actually Christian more so than anything, but I prefer to call myself just a man of God, because I don't like labels. I think labeling myself as one thing or the other when they're ultimately the same is kind of dumb. People get caught up in labels in scripture so much, and so limiting, which is the complete opposite of what God wants for us, right? I don't claim to know God better than anybody, but I do know that the only thing that's certain about God is that he wants us to work together to leave the world better than we found it, right? He wants us to spread the love that he's given us and shown us, right? And I've seen that in my own life constantly since going into it. Like, I can preach gospel all I want, but until somebody starts to show that light and love, not of being someone of faith, but of being someone of God, which is two totally different things. Being somebody of faith is following scripture, right? Being somebody of God is just showing love and light and service as often as you can, and dedicating your life to leaving the world better than you found it, however you can, right? Provided it's more than what social media paints us to constantly strive for, right? It's what you do behind closed doors when cameras aren't on that makes so much more of a difference than like somebody giving a homeless person a couple grand on TikTok or something like that for views. For me, like, when I'm like, one of the first things that I was told when I started going to church, because I would have doubts and stuff like that and be criticizing the church in my own head, was I actually ended up speaking, and I've spoken to Pastor Phil, who's my pastor, a few times. And it's like, often people who've written the scripture wrote it wrong and went against the very message that they were supposed to be preaching, right, for their own selfish needs, right, which has ultimately damaged kind of religion as a whole, right? Colonization, greed, oppression of other cultures and stuff like that for not being the same, and using faith as an excuse, that kind of stuff, right? That's all horrific stuff. Homophobia, sexism, racism, all these things are all horrific things, but these are not the message of somebody that created us in love. And that's a hard thing.
Really quick.
Yeah, of course.
Set a thought that struck me real quick.
Yeah.
Did you ever see Jordan Peterson's interpretation of like the psychological relevance of the Bible? He has like biblical stories. Did you ever see any of those?
I've heard of them. I've not seen them yet.
I just started the other day, the first one, and something just struck me from what he said. How you're saying how they like kind of broke their own rules, right? So the person who wrote it broke their own rule, or went against their own scripture that they wrote.
Yeah.
And he was saying that the genius of religion is that it's made so that there's always a person higher than even the highest person, to say like the priest or like whatever, the person of power. There's always someone higher than them that they have to go to. So like basically the person that's highest in the hierarchy doesn't have all the say. So it's like, because like humans will inevitably make mistakes and inevitably break the rules.
Yeah.
But the scriptures and the writing still stands as truth.
That's it.
So it's like you're not following the actual what people are doing, or you're not following the people, as you're following and they're not following. They're not the highest. They're not the highest. I don't know what's like form of.
They're not the top of the heap, so to speak.
Yeah, they're not the highest form of God or the highest form of the religion. They're just the person there. And it's like you're always looking to God, something bigger than the person or the individual.
That's it. I found one of the most important lessons I learned when it came to understanding my faith was anybody who claims to speak for God probably is wrong, is definitely wrong, because nobody can, right? All we can do is interpret his meanings through love. The texts have been mistranslated dozens and dozens of times and revised dozens and dozens of times. So there's no way really to know for sure. All we can do is follow the foundational message and go by that basis, right? So there's even plenty of rules in the Bahai faith and scriptures in the Bahai faith that some of them were designed for certain time periods 200 years ago, but they are not necessarily always followed now by modern Baha'is, because they don't really line up with the message of unity necessarily, or they do, but they're not necessarily fitting with the circumstances necessary, right? Like all faiths 200 years ago had rules against homosexuality, right, as a sin and that kind of stuff, right? But as a Baha'i now, you look at that and it's like, well, if I'm telling somebody that loving somebody else a certain way is wrong, then am I really promoting unity, right? So that those conversations come up and you're like, yeah, no, the message is always going to be love and unity amongst our peoples. We don't care how that looks, right? We just want to spread love properly. So that, and I think that's been such an instrumental thing for me, is knowing that typically, especially in the modern world, if it's divisive and if it brings pain to people unnecessarily, then it's probably not the way to go. That's not to say that everything is all sunshine and rainbows, but there's a difference between oppressing somebody needlessly, just out of like a lack of agreement, so to speak, or understanding, versus kind of going through the deep work that's necessary to kind of open your heart up to a light that you can spread, right? There's a difference between just being mean to somebody because they're different than you versus telling somebody like and holding somebody to account so that they develop into the best version of themselves that they can then go and also serve their communities most efficiently. One of the things I'm blessed about in my community is that my friends and my people in it will always call me on my nonsense when I get stuck in that. Because again, I'm not perfect, I'm very flawed as a human being. They definitely can be stubborn, can definitely be a hard ass, can definitely, be very kind of no BS when it comes to certain things. But then my friends will approach me and be like, hey, this isn't helpful right now. And this is why, right? And hold me to account so that I can grow, right?
I think it's interesting too, like you talked about that a lot, was the relevance of like really what it is, it's kind of like a guide to become the best version of yourself. If you think about like what the Bible is, like starting with the individual, it's like a guide and a bunch of stories that are aiming to make you the best version of yourself and therefore the best version of the community or tribe.
Yeah, that's it. The underlying message of growth. And I think that's something that's very dominant in all of the deeper aspects of humanity, right? It's like we're always striving to grow as people, not in the monetary sense, but just as people, right? Especially the older we get, right? In the beginning, it's about making the money and the career. But then as you get even to your mid-20s, like you and I, like it's more along the lines of like, okay, how am I working through the stuff in my heart and the demons that I'm kind of wrestling with so that I can, be in a better place to help others.
I think it's avoiding the pitfalls too, right? Like, like living your life, living a meaningless life, or living a life full of darkness.
Yeah. Which is very easy to fall into. Because there's a period just before the pandemic where I was kind of in that, so to speak. Indulging in all the things that a young man my age would probably indulge in but shouldn't, and wasn't helpful to my own heart and wasn't helpful. That was something that I've noticed with myself over the last year, 2 years, romantic, like in specific relationships, romantic wise. I've struggled with the level of a level of self-respect, but also a level of intimacy that goes past sort of base values because of conditional things taught and then traumas from past relationships, that kind of stuff. So I would be, that guy that, would be single all the time and still sleep around, which was ultimately hollow and falling into a pitfall of just kind of giving into temptations and diving into things that are destructive and harmful. And I remember it got to a point where it actually really damaged a very specific friendship of mine with myself and this person. And we had to do a lot of work and a lot of like hard conversations to heal that. And it's now stronger than it's ever been, thank God. But there was a lot of messiness we needed to navigate. And that was sort of the wake up call, right? Of like, this is not what I want to be. And this is not the example I should be setting. And this is not the message I want to leave behind in the hearts of others. So for me that's something that I still work through now. I'm seeing therapists about that kind of stuff, like navigating that aspect of my life in a much healthier manner. But it's real easy, because even when I was running these kids camps and working with these people and doing these things for my community and preaching these morals, I was catching myself and like, you're a hypocrite, sometimes in certain circumstances, depending on what you're talking about. And I was like, you know what, like I'm a work in progress, and clearly that work is in need of more progress. So but I think that level of accountability for self is super valuable and helpful, as much of a pain as it can be sometimes, because if you can always look at yourself and say, you know what, I slipped up, then that means there's an opportunity to be better, right? Versus if you're just like, no, that's not really a big deal, don't worry about it. And you're just like, well, now you've ruined these amount of friendships and damaged these kinds of, these people's views of what a relationship should be and that kind of stuff. And now these people have baggage to work through, because hurt people, right? So, yeah. There's a lot there.
Yeah, the accountability. I think you're a hypocrite if you don't work on it.
Yeah. It's because it's like, if I'm telling somebody your relationships with people are very important, but only if they're relationships built on love and service and supporting one another and uplifting one another and showing each other tenderness and kindness and nothing but compassion and empathy, but also encouraging them to grow. But then you're involving yourself in kind of very frivolous, destructive, indulgent behavior with your friends, and then not doing anything to change it, right? Because it's one thing to slip up, it's another thing to keep doing something when you know it's wrong, at least for you as a person. And then just, tell it's the same thing. Like you see on the extreme end of it, you see like priests preaching about, abstinence before marriage, but then they're fined for certain allegations and certain kind of crimes that they've committed that are of the worst variety in that sense of like adultery or sexual violence or something along those lines. And like that's the extreme case of it. But on the much more small scale, but still damaging in their own ways case, it's the guy who's saying like your relationship should be on love and friendship, but then you're indulging in casual sex or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
There's a level of, when you're preaching a message of love and unity, but you're not following it, it becomes hollow, right?
Yeah, I think that integrity.
Mm-hmm. Integrity is a hard thing too. That's why it can be very rare, right, amongst people, because integrity means looking at yourself every day, and if you see something that's slipping up, being like, you know what, this can't stand, this has got to be fixed, and doing so in a way that's not just beating yourself up.
Yeah. That's very wise.
Yeah.
I think you have a lot of wisdom to share.
Yeah, I got a lot of life lessons. I screwed up a lot. And thankfully, when you screw up, you learn things. So, and I learned things the hard way. So there was a lot of screw ups there. But I'm grateful for it because it brought me to the man that I am today. And when I look and see that guy in the mirror, I'm like, you know what, this is not the complete package, not the full project completion, but doing okay, all things considered. I'm not, I struggle, of course, still with depressive spells, anxiety spells, that kind of stuff. But especially I write all the time now. I have a very small writing page on Instagram called The Writing Neanderthal. I don't really do it for followers. I mostly just do it as an outlet to put things out constantly, to get it out of my head. Shameless plug. But so I'll write something that's on my brain at the time and just put it out there. And that's a way that I kind of retrospect on myself and work through what's navigating my head and kind of think about it and reflect it. And I'll write it in my journal and stuff like that. And the constant creative process that I go through right now is on constant reflection of who I am and what I want to be. I even reflect that in bits and pieces through the D&D campaign that I'm running currently, and stuff like that. Everywhere I go, I'm telling stories, but I'm telling stories that have a moral that I can also learn from without realizing it, because I think that's become a very foundational part of who I am, is that at my core, I'm somebody who is telling himself, but also telling the world a story that is ultimately going to lead to a level of growth that is hopefully very positive. So yeah, but I think that also comes down from my family being a group of people that we shared a family history through stories. There was nothing really written down because we were, gypsies for a period of our family history. So a lot of us were illiterate tradesmen kind of thing. So my grandfather, basically, yeah, except there was a trailer park. It was Papa was notorious for telling stories constantly of his childhood and constantly having anything like family barbecue, birthdays, campfires. You'd be driving with him to a workplace that day, just doing a job together, and he would have a story for every occasion. He met Andre the Giant in Montreal, and then the same day he accidentally dyed his dad's hair bright blue. That kind of stuff, right? Like he was, so that was what I learned from in regards to storytelling. And that was kind of like, I carry that into my own life now. There's wisdom in stories. So there's wisdom in remembering what you've been through and learning from it constantly so that you can then share that information with other people.
Right. Can I ask, like, you mentioned you have depression and anxiety spells. Last time we chatted, it was a while ago, like, I know that you said you were a pretty dark place around that time. And, just thinking back and knowing you for a while, like you mentioned, like you're going for runs in the morning, you were doing a lot to kind of cope. So how are you feeling now? And did you feel like when you got on this path, at some point, did that start to quiet down?
I think for me at the moment, that will always be an uphill battle. But an uphill battle I'm very well steeled for, so to speak. I struggle with it in moments, and I know what makes it worse and what makes it better. And I know when I slip up, sometimes there are just days where you're just, everything on the news is bad, the world is bad, you're overstressed, you're sick, you might have COVID, nothing's going right. So you know what, today's a day where we're just gonna lay in bed, watch videos that make us feel good, eat some good food, and kind of just take care of our hearts right now. And then there are days where your anxiety is through the roof because of all the other mentioned stuff, and maybe you need to have an attack to get it out of your system, and then sit in a depressive spell for the next week or so as your body's kind of recovering from that, and talk about it with your friends and your family and be like, hey, like I'm struggling right now. But it's one of those things that, especially over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of deep traumas from my past that I've kind of resurfaced and have been working through over time. And there are a lot of days that are rough. There's no doubt about that in my mind. There are a lot of days where it's like you get up and you're just like, you know what, like I don't want to die, but I don't want to do anything today, right? Like it's like what you get up and you're just like, I'm not critically horrific, but like I am not feeling being a human being right now, right? Like I'm definitely in a cloud of darkness right now, and I just kind of have to navigate. But there's a level of, I have a level of comfort in knowing that I've been faced with this stuff before, and everything I've been through already, I've overcome. So anything that I could ever be through again, or anything new that comes my way, I can navigate and overcome because I'm not alone. And I think, again, community is super important for me in the sense that it's extremely critical to surround yourself when you struggle with like depression and anxiety with support groups, circles that are willing to support you and be there for you, and maybe just sit with you while you bawl your eyes out and kind of just give you a hug when you need it, right? As opposed to just working through it all the time like I used to. I found in the past, I would do stuff to, some of it was really helpful, like the training was good to kind of give you the endorphin rush to deal with it for a while, but then also the crash would lead to it sometimes getting worse after the fact. Caffeine crash, and then obviously like the dopamine crash. And ultimately it was a distraction for me personally. It may not be that way for everybody, but for me, a lot of the time it was. But also training has been very therapeutic for me in that it helps me get out. Now when I go into it, I kind of go into it with not the intention to distract myself from how I'm feeling, but to feel it truly and entirely in my body and work through it constantly, right? So in everything that you're doing, you harness it and use it as productive energy in what you're doing. And then afterwards, you might just go home, have a protein shake and some eggs, and then just sit and cry for 4 hours if you need to get it out. And then like, you know what, today was a rough day, but it's over now, and now I have the opportunity to start it. And there are ups and downs, and there are high points and low points, but I'm in a position in my life now where, because of the support systems I have in place, nothing feels hopeless anymore, right? Which for me is a very, very important thing, because there are many periods of my life where things felt entirely hopeless. And I didn't feel like I had anything in my life kind of that would get me through that. But now I do, right? So yeah, I would say that it's definitely a lot better than it's been, but there are definitely slip up points, and there are definitely points where you just have down days, and there are definitely points where your depression is like he's rearing his ugly head and he's going to be there for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, and you just kind of have to navigate it. But ultimately, I do my best to take care of myself when it happens, and to not let it limit me, not let my desire to take a hibernation from life prevent me from living, so to speak. You know.
I think that's an interesting point, because you mentioned like with community. I think like the in hibernation, I think like the first thing you want to do when you're feeling like shit is isolate yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Push
like,
people away.
what has your experience been like? And it's oftentimes it's like, that's not what you should be doing at all.
Yeah, but it's your first reaction, especially with guys. We're so bad for it.
Yeah.
Right? Like we can't let people see us cry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
like with community, when you do go, like when you're in that bad state and you do go to
I think
your community.
it was hard for a really long time. It still sometimes is, to have those really vulnerable moments, but to sit there and tell my friends, hey, I'm struggling right now. Like I'm not at my best. I need you to be a bit more patient with me. I'm wrestling with this. And just to know that, and for them to like, you know what, like I'm here for you. Let me know if you need anything, I've got you. And then to give you the words of love and reassurance. That makes a huge difference in itself. But I remember when my grandfather had passed away, I kind of grieved him a bit, but not properly. I never really talked about it much because it was kind of just a really touchy subject with the family. And I've always been a pillar of strength for the family. So it was one of those things that it never felt right to talk about it much. At least on my end, it never felt right for me to kind of voice my vulnerabilities and that kind of stuff. But when I got back to the island and I started navigating it, and I remember it really vividly, like I shared a piece of poetry that I had written about my grandfather and about a dream I kept having about my grandfather and stuff like that, and the grief relating to it. And we had that conversation and that really vulnerable, tearful moment that I had at a devotional gathering with a friend of mine. That was sort of the point where, you know, I like, this is so important for me to have right now. This is so important for navigating this, right? It doesn't replace the realms of like therapy and medication and stuff like that. For some people it would. I'm not saying you can cure depression by having good friends, but it certainly makes the journey a lot less painful. And it was one of those things that when I was dealing with that mixed with grief and navigating all of those things at once, having the support group there and turning around and saying, you know what, like I'm not okay. And I really just need some support right now. And then immediately like, we've got you. That in itself was a game changer. And I'm blessed in every single sense of the word to have that, because that's so rare sometimes, right? Like I count my blessings every single day that I have what I have, because this community means nothing more than the world to me in that sense.
That's so awesome, man.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. And it can be yours too for $29.99. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But yeah, it's something that we want to spread to everybody. It's something that we want to share constantly, because everybody should have that.
If someone's interested in Bahai, where can they learn more? Whether they're here or somewhere else.
Well, I mean, anywhere. There's Bahai communities pretty near anywhere. But like, yeah, there are people throughout, like people can message me on stuff like that and I can get them in touch with people, but like, there's not like a forum, so to speak, I don't know of for sure. But there's definitely Bahai communities. There's definitely activities going on. There's definitely like, we have potlucks and stuff like that. We're going to be looking to do a lot more to kind of bring more friends into the community, because it's also important, just because like, you're not expected to become a Bahai, by joining the community, right? We're not interested in converting anybody. That's not how we do things. It's not like a cult where you have to join it and be part of it and that kind of stuff, right? Like we just want to bring people in and kind of spread the love and spread the sense of community and kind of spread that light. So we have gatherings and stuff like that, and we're going to be having more of them to kind of start kind of bringing new friends into the fold, because a lot of our major guys have packed up and moved. They've gone off to different aspects of their life, because PEI is a lovely place to live, but when you're trying to get your life started outside of starting career and finishing school and stuff like that, sometimes it can be hard. So a lot of guys packed up and moved.
So is there a website they could go to find more information or anything? Do you know?
Website. Well, yeah, definitely. Yeah. If you just Google the Bahai faith, you could probably find all kinds of stuff. And the Junior Youth Empowerment, like Spiritual Empowerment Program, is the program that we do primarily with the Junior Youth. But then there's people in the community. Paul Vreeland, who's very prominent within like writers groups on PEI. Alana Vreeland, his wife, works very closely with a lot of the women's groups. Roxanne Kleinveld and myself are very involved with church communities, but also just other communities all throughout the island. Roxy's only been here a few short years, and she's very popular amongst most circles. A lot of teachers know Baha'is because a lot of Baha'is become teachers. So yeah, even it's just people typically end up like, hey, I'm looking to make new friends, and I'm like, come to this gathering, and then that's how they kind of get it. That's how I got introduced for the most part. So there's always stuff going on. Typically, we'll advertise like university or like group fairs.
Okay, very interesting. Well, I just want to say thanks so much for coming on again, man. It was really awesome to talk to you and all the things you've been up to, and thank you for sharing all this.
I'm happy to be here, brother. It was good to hear from you too. Right, it's been a while, so it was nice to catch up.
For sure, man. All right. Love you, Lynds.
Love you too, buddy. There you go.